Okay, so in this episode, I'm going to talk about a fascinating study just came out. It was a literature review and meta-analysis on the effects of lockdowns on COVID-19 mortality. It was a Johns Hopkins study, and I'm sure it's going to be all the buzz in the media for a little while. But it was only 60-something pages long, so I thought, hey, I'll go through it. So I'm going to go through it with you step by step and unpack it for you. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this episode of the Leadersmith podcast.
You are listening to The Leadersmith, Darren Gertis.
Okay, so as I said, I was watching the news this morning. There was this Johns Hopkins study about COVID-19 mortality and the efficacy of lockdowns. Now, I do not claim to be an economist or public health kind of specialist. I do have a PhD. My PhD is in organizational leadership, but this is a meta-analysis. I can read it. I understand what to do. I have my students working on meta-analyses right now. My graduate students have to do this project with 100 meta-analyses. And I have enough economics credit hours that I can teach minor economics. I have a second master's beyond my MBA in public policy. So I'm reasonably well qualified to be able to explain this. I am not the author. I am not suggesting that I'm the author or anything along those lines. But what I can do is go through this study with you and kind of help you make sense of it. So this was done it was an article printed in Studies in Applied Economics. It's under the Johns Hopkins Institute for Applied Economics, Global Health, and the Study of Business Enterprise. Okay, so the authors are laying down some basic concepts. So I'm going to read little bits of it along the way, and then I'll interpret it. And so the study was designed to determine, and I'm quoting now, to determine whether there is empirical evidence to support the belief that lockdowns reduce COVID-19 mortality. That is, if we lock everything down like they did in California, that it will somehow minimize the death rate or have a significant effect on it. So they looked at 18,590 studies. That's a lot of studies, and they boiled them down to about 24 studies when it's all said and done, because they had to make sure that they're getting, apples to apples kinds of analysis. Now, the 24 studies, when you're looking at multiple studies, that's called a meta-analysis. And you're basically saying, what do all the studies say about whatever the topic is? And when you do that, what you're doing is you're triangulating. This one will say a little bit more, that one will say a little bit less, and you're getting to a real solid average or center point that you can really hang your hat on. Okay, so 24 studies were included in the meta-analysis. And so they would talk about things like shutting things down or shelter in place or things along those lines. They said this, quote, an analysis of each of these three groups support the conclusion that lockdowns have had little to no effect on COVID mortality. Now, I'm going to explain how we get there in just a little bit, but the lockdowns, the very draconian lockdowns, like think California, think Australia, did have some kind of an effect, but it was very small. It was only about 2% and change. And so what's going on? You would think that those places that have locked down enormously would have had a greater bang for the buck than just 2% difference than places that didn't lock down. Okay, so I'm walking through it. That was just the abstract. Page 3 was talking about of the 186 countries covered by the Oxford COVID-19 government response tracker. That's a big thing in this world. Only Comoros, I don't even know where Comoros is. It's an island country in the Indian Ocean, did not impose at least one type of NPI, and that's a compulsory non-pharmaceutical intervention, is an NPI by the end of March 2020. So pretty much the whole world locked down in some way or another. And so it's hard to get data to compare against, like generally when you do a study, you'll do things like you'll have here's where the people that experimented and here's the people with the placebo, right? This is the control group. Comoros is about the only control that's out there. So it was hard to get good data. And that's why it reduced from 18,000 down to like 24 articles. Okay, so he said in pages 3 to 4, researchers at Imperial College London predicted that a suppression strategy based on a lockdown would reduce COVID-19 and mortality by up to 98%. Like, that is quite a claim that you're going to reduce it like that. It wasn't like that. It didn't turn out to be anything like that. Okay, so one researcher showed that, quote, across all countries and U.S. states that we study, the growth rates of daily deaths from COVID-19 fell from a wide range of initially high levels to levels close to zero within 20 to 30 days after each region experienced 25 cumulative deaths. Unquote. So what it's saying is it had essentially the same pattern. It would hit an area, there would be some effect, and then it would kind of level out on its own, just not, you didn't need a lockdown in order to get there. Okay. Let me also clarify something. I am not making an argument one way or another. Okay. I'm not being pro this or anti that or anything like this. I'm just unpacking what's in here and trying to give you some commentary to help you understand what's actually happening. Okay. So I'm not trying to, I'm an academic trying to interpret something that that academics wrote so that you can understand and you can hear this. So please don't send me hate mail about this position or that position. You don't know which position I'm in. I'm just interpreting what's here. Okay, so there was no clear, the article goes on, there was no clear negative correlation between the degree of lockdown and fatalities in the spring of 2020, which is really interesting because you would think that there would be some significant effect. Okay, now they go on to define their terms on page 5. Our definition does not include government recommendations, government information campaigns, access to mass testing, voluntary social distancing. But their definition of what they mean by lockdown, it does include, quote, mandated interventions such as closing schools or businesses, mandated face masks, etc. We define lockdown as any policy consisting of at least one NPI as described above. Okay, so those like more thinking like heavy-handed kind of, no, we must close your business, we must close down the school, that kind of thing. Okay. So it goes on a little bit, and he's talking about the search strategy on page 6. We used a wide range, I'm quoting again, we used a wide range of search terms, which are combinations of 3 search strings, a disease search string like COVID, corona, coronavirus, SARS. And so now here they're talking about how they're searching for this. We identified papers on 1,360 terms. We also required mentions of deaths and mortality. And so that's how they're finding these 18,000 studies. And they're asking 2 primary questions. 1, does the study measure the effect of lockdowns on mortality? Now, there's lots of coronavirus articles, but does it measure the effect of lockdowns on mortality? 1. And then 2, does the study use empirical ex post difference in difference approach? Now, what does that mean? It means it measures actual stuff, not theoretical, this is what's predicted to happen, but actual things. Well, after they screened those 18,000 and change articles, they got to 117 studies, which were retrieved, and then they reviewed those 117 studies. And then all studies were assessed, they say on page 8, all studies were assessed by at least 2 researchers during this process. Another 64 papers were excluded, so that they about halved it, more than halved it. Because it didn't meet the eligibility criteria. 9 studies with too little jurisdictional variance were excluded, and I'll define jurisdictional variance because that's going to be important. They were excluded, and 10 synthetic control studies were also excluded. So it has to be legitimate studies that actually measured something in real life, not just theoretical. Okay, the eligibility criteria. I'm again reading. Quote, we distinguish between 2 methods used to establish a relationship or lack of relationship between mortality rates and lockdown policies. The first uses registered cross-sectional mortality data. These are ex post studies. So it's actually who died. Okay, so that's what it's asking. The second method uses simulated data on mortality and infection rates, and these are ex ante studies. Now, they're not going to use those. quote, we include all studies using counterfactual difference in difference approach from the former group, but disregard all ex ante studies. So again, they're not using those. And there's a reason for that. And we want to make sure that we're actually seeing reality. Okay. Given our criteria, page 9, given our criteria, we exclude the much cited paper by Flaxman et al. 2020, which claimed that lockdown saved 3 million lives in Europe. Okay, so you can predict or project, hey, we're saving so many lives, and politicians want to run victory laps based on that. But Flaxman et al. Assumed that the pandemic would follow an epidemiological curve unless countries lock down. So based on a particular assumption, they can predict that, but maybe that's not what happened. Again, we're still on page 9. Preferably, the effect of lockdown should be tested using randomized controlled trials, natural experiments, or the like. However, there are very few studies of this type. Of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic. You're not taking time to dispassionately think about this. So they excluded all synthetic control studies as well. Okay, then we talked about this term on page 10, jurisdictional variance. For the same reason, we also exclude studies with little jurisdictional variance. And so if the study is about the same place rather than, so let me explain it like this. If I can see the difference between California and Florida, then I can compare. If I'm just looking at California and more California, you really can't compare very much. So that's jurisdictional variance. If it has little jurisdictional variance, it's not going to tell us very much. So they exclude based on that. They also talked about publication status and date. So we include all expo studies. That's the real, like really what happened studies, regardless of publication status and date. And then they said the role of optimal timing. Now, they say we exclude papers which analyze the effect of early lockdowns in contrast to later lockdowns. So there's at least two problems that arise with respect to evaluating the effect of well-timed lockdowns, because if you time it right, you can get different kind of data or different type of results. So that's part of the way that they're looking at it. And secondly, they say this, secondly, quote, it's extremely difficult to differentiate between the effect of public awareness to the effect of lockdowns and when looking at the timing, because people and politicians are likely to react to the same information. As figure 4 illustrates, all European countries and US states that were hit hard and early by COVID-19 experienced high mortality rates, whereas countries hit relatively late experienced low mortality rates. Okay, so there's different amounts of information. Maybe people are better able to prevent what's going on, but the role of timing is important. And so they want to make sure the timing isn't messing with what's going on here as well. So they're getting a clear picture of what's going on. But they conclude this section by saying this, quote, however, if lockdowns have a notable effect, we should see this effect regardless of timing. And we should identify this effect more correctly by excluding studies that exhaustively analyze timing. So you want to make sure that you're getting as clear data as possible. Okay, now we're down to page 12 under empirical evidence preliminary considerations. They say this, quote, while the policy conclusions contained in some studies are based on statistically significant results, many of these conclusions are ill-founded due to the tiny impact associated with said statistically significant results. So if your sample is too small, or if you don't have enough of a group, it's hard to see if something's actually, is this a real conclusion or is it as good as randomness? So if I flip a coin and I get it twice and I get it on heads, wow, 100% results that I got it on heads. That's not really as good as if I flip it 300 times and then I see that really I'm going to get heads about half the time and tails about half the time. Okay, so that's kind of what we're saying. Ashraf, and I'm quoting again, Ashraf 2020 states that social distance measures have proven effective in controlling the spread of a highly contagious virus. However, that's a quote. And then the authors go on and say, however, their estimates show that the average lockdown in Europe and the US only reduced COVID-19 mortality by 2.4%. So what's going on? Okay, a little bit further down the page on page 13, quote, virtually all countries in the world implemented mandated NPIs in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So, I mean, pretty much everywhere you go, they're doing it. And what they're doing is they're looking at what their neighbors are doing and then doing that same thing. Hence, most estimates are relative to doing the least, which in many Western countries means relative to doing as Sweden has done, especially during the first wave, when Sweden, due to constitutional constraints, implemented very few restrictions. So only that little island in the Indian Ocean did less, right? Like they didn't do anything. And Sweden did very little just because their constitution did not permit them to do certain things. Like the Australians are like locked down still at this time as I'm talking. And our constitution provided certain freedoms as well, even though things, locked down some. Sweden had even less. Okay, so that's like a as close as you're going to get to a control group. Okay, a little bit further down on page 14, Bandari et al. That means Bandari is the author of a study, and his colleagues et al. Means and all the rest. Bandari et al. 2020 find relatively large effects of doing something, but no effect of doing more. This is a really important line to understanding what's going on here. Bandari et al. Find relatively large effects of doing something, but no effect of doing more. Now, this is again interesting because if you're doing something, taking some precautions, that's great, that gets you there. But if you go all the way and stamp out all the freedom in order to have this security against the coronavirus, you're not actually getting any extra bang for the buck, but you're losing all this freedom. And that's a really interesting something going on, a really interesting dynamic. They find no extra effect of stricter lockdowns relative to less strict lockdowns. And so they're going to explain how they look at that in just a moment. We state that the effects of lockdowns is 0 compared to Sweden's doing the least. So if there's 0, Sweden's right next to it, and that's about a baseline or a control group. Okay, now overview of the findings of eligible studies. So out of the 34 studies that remained after they pared down 18,000 to 160 something, they got down to 34, and then there were 22 peer-reviewed and 12 working papers. Now, there's a difference between a peer-reviewed study, which is academics reading other academics' papers and saying, yes, this is legitimate, or no, send this back because he didn't think about X, Y, and Z. These authors said this thing, and they're not including this, and they need to reform this. So that's a good way. Peer review is a good way to make sure that something is actually legit. Working papers are just working papers. They're just they may or may not have the same strength. Okay, geographically, 14 studies cover countries worldwide, 4 covered European countries, 13 covered the United States, 2 covered Europe and the United States, and 1 was just Italy. Okay, several studies found no significant effect of lockdown on mortality. Now, that's kind of bizarre. So now listen, if it was just one study, you could see the one study saying there's no effect, and you could find another study saying there is an effect of 5%, 10%, whatever the percent is. Okay, so when you take all the studies and you aggregate them, you're triangulating on that variation in order to get what's probably a truer number. And that's what a meta-analysis is doing. Okay, other studies found a significant negative relationship between lockdowns and mortality. So, for example, shelters in place showed that it reduced mortality by 35%. That's the high end. Now, and they find that employee mask mandates reduce mortality by 34%. That's another study. And closing businesses and bars reduced mortality by 29%. Now, those were some studies. Some other studies found a significant positive relationship between lockdown and mortality. And so we find is that some authors found stricter lockdowns, higher OXCG-RT, that's that Oxford rating system, stringency increased COVID mortality by 0.01%. So there's studies that show that the lockdowns actually increase deaths rather than minimize deaths. So we're all over the map here. So what are we seeing? Shelter in place increased mortality by 1% after 14 days. Sure, there's other effects. So if you shelter in place and you have it, you're spreading to all your relatives. You can't go outside. You're just breathing all the same air. Suicide rates go up. All kinds of things happen that we aren't factoring in, that we need to factor in if we're going to really see clearly. Okay, one author is cited here, Sabatu et al. 2020, show that government policies are strongly driven by the policies initiated in neighboring countries rather than the severity of the pandemic in their own countries. Well, that's interesting. So that's kind of how we operate in the university. So I teach at CSU. And what we do is we look at what the county school systems are doing when there's going to be a hurricane or once every 7 years or so snow, right? Well, what are they doing? If they're shutting down, we'll probably shut down. So that's what it's talking about here. We're looking at what the neighbors are doing. Okay, let me continue here. And so far, hopefully, I've unpacked some things that have helped you understand this. And let's continue. So Ashraf 2020 estimated that, quote, a large or small effect relative to the 98% reduction in mortality predicted by the study published by the Imperial College of London, Ferguson et al. So this is the subject for our meta-analysis in the next section. Here, it turns out that, and it gives a bunch of math here. So some of the math, it averages to only an effect of like 2.4%. So instead of this 98% reduction of mortality that was predicted, you actually only see this really small effect of about 2.4% when you have this much more heavy-handed shutdown or lockdown. Okay, I'm now to page 24, section 4. And so I'm going to leave the link below if you want to look at the study on your own. You're more than welcome to look at it on your own and see it for yourself. Page 24, section 4. So it says mortality is measured as COVID-19 related deaths per million. And they go on and say, our focus is on the effect of compulsory non-pharmaceutical interventions, those are NPIs, and the policies that restrict internal movement, close schools and businesses, ban international travel, among others. We do not look at the effect of voluntary behavioral changes, so voluntary mask wearing, for example, the effect of recommendations, when governments recommend that you do these things. They're not looking at that. They're looking at the effects of when government is locking down. Now, what's interesting about that is if the government just puts out information, people make decisions without having to have a mandatory, effect, some kind of ban by the government. People already start making those decisions because who wants to get sick, right? So they can do that on their own. Okay, now they talk about quality dimensions. This is very important because this is how they strain the studies. So there were 4 quality dimensions. So the first was, is it a peer-reviewed or working papers? And you want to have as much peer-reviewed papers as possible, right? Long and short time period. Well, why does the time period matter? Because if you have a short time period, you don't know if your data is good or not. Like if you're locked down over a long time period, then you can probably see more results than over a much shorter time period. So they say short data periods, quote, yield biased results if lockdowns only flatten the curve and do not actually prevent deaths. Okay, then the next one is no early effect on mortality. And what they mean by that is they want studies that well, let me read it. It says, on average, it takes approximately 3 weeks from infection to death. Okay. However, several studies found effects of lockdown on mortality almost immediately. Well, that shouldn't be, right? Something else is going on. There's other variables in it. It's somehow contaminated. So you don't want early effects on mortality. And then finally, the 4th criterion was social sciences versus other sciences. So epidemiologists and researchers in natural sciences should know more about COVID, but social scientists are experts in evaluating the effects of policy decisions. And so we're leaning on studies by social scientists about the effects of policy decisions because that's what this paper is about, right? So you want to have 4 categories, if humanly possible, of these 4 quality dimensions. You want to have all 4. If you have 3, it's reasonably strong. If you only have 2, what are your conclusions? If you only have 1, what good is it? Okay, so here's some of the conclusions that they got to, and I'm quoting here. We also considered including a quality dimension to distinguish between studies based on excessive mortality and studies based on COVID-19 mortality, as we believe that excess mortality is potentially better measure. What they mean by that is we know how many died in 2019? How many people in your country died in 2019? How many died in 2018? How many died in 2017? If in 2020 you see a big spike above and beyond that, well, then that should tell you that something else is going on. Let's say 100 people died in 2018. Obviously, it's more. Let's say 100,000 people died in a particular country in 2018, 100,000 in 2019, 100,000 in 20. Now it's 150,000 in 2020. Well, that spike is probably caused by something. Okay. And that's what we're talking about. So we want to look at excess mortality. Now, he says, first, data on total deaths in the country is far more precise than data on COVID-19 related deaths. And what they mean by that is like, we actually know how many people died. Okay. But how many people died from COVID-19, that's hard to determine. And again, they're academics and they're being as fair as possible with the variables. They said, first, data on total deaths is far more precise, which because COVID deaths, quote, may be both underreported due to lack of tests, like we didn't know if it was COVID or not, but they died, or overreported because some people die with, but not because of COVID. Now, that's an interesting variable, right? If they die with COVID, they're reported as a COVID death, but it might have just been that they died of something else and they had COVID simultaneously, or that COVID was a comorbidity kind of something where it was happening at the same time, but it wasn't necessarily COVID that did it. So it's hard to determine what's COVID and what's not. Secondly, they say, quote, a major purpose of lockdowns is to save lives. So to the extent lockdowns shift deaths from COVID to other causes like suicide or other things along those lines, estimates based on COVID-19 mortality will overestimate the effects of lockdowns. So let's say 100 people die because of COVID. But if suicides go up from 15 to 30, now it's actually not just 100 that die of COVID. It's actually 115 because of the excess from suicide. It's not COVID particularly getting them, but it's something else that's doing it. And they go the other way as well. Likewise, if lockdowns save lives in other ways, so for example, fewer traffic accidents, people weren't driving as much during COVID, right? In fact, there were some people that I know that had their insurance give them a refund for lack of miles driven during COVID. Okay. So maybe there's fewer traffic accidents. Lockdown effects on mortality will be underestimated. So we have to try to take in the full picture. And that's the point of what we're trying to do. Okay. So I'm now down to page 28, Stringency Index Studies. Okay, so hopefully this is making sense so far. Stringency Index Studies. So they said 7 eligible studies examine the link between lockdown stringency and COVID-19 mortality. That is, how severe, how draconian are the lockdown measures? All studies are based on the COVID-19 government response tracker. That's that Oxford study that we talked about earlier, the Stringency Index. So the Oxford Stringency Index, quote, neither measures the expected effectiveness of the lockdowns nor the expected costs, but it's based on 9 equally related parameters. So they're not concerned with whether your economy is going to crash or there's suicide out or whatever the other effects are of the lockdown. Okay, think about this, like the higher you go in the scale, the more that the more draconian the measures are. So the common estimates show that the effect of the average lockdown in Europe and the United States, with an average stringency, that's the term that they use, of 76 and 74 respectively between March 16th and April 15th, 2020, compared to a policy based solely on recommendation, like, hey, warning, there's a problem. You want to do something about this, wear a mask or whatever. Not you must wear a mask, but it's probably a good idea. That would be a stringency of only 44%. And then they did the math, and I'm not going to get into the deep math, but the average lockdown in Europe between March 16th and April 15th, 2020 was 32 points stricter than the policy based only on recommendations. In the United States, it was 30 points stricter than a policy just based on recommendations. Now, the total effect of this lockdown, and I'm reading here, the total effect of the lockdowns compared to the recommendation policy was, and they do some maths and they show, what the average is, and it's only like a 2.8% difference in the death toll, like in mortality. So it's a very small degree difference in if you have these draconian lockdowns and if you don't. And so that's where the study's going. And they say this: based on stringency index studies, we find little to no evidence that mandated lockdowns in Europe and the United States had a noticeable effect on COVID-19 mortality rates. Now, please, by the way, don't be hating on me. Early on in one of my earliest podcasts, I had a friend who was my age. I'm 48. He was in my elementary school class, and he was on a ventilator. Like, it's not supposed to hit people our age. And so I was, saying, hey, look, this can happen. I want you to hear his story because I want you to know what this is like. And then you can make your decisions from there. That's kind of like what they're doing when they're saying having a recommendation policy. I want you to have facts, and I want you to understand what's going on, and then you make your decision. That's different than draconian lockdown. Like, you may not go anywhere, your business must be closed, you must work from home, or schools on Zoom or whatever. Okay. They go on and say, to sum up, we find that the studies that meet at least 3 of 4 quality measures, remember we talked about these 4 quality measures, that lockdowns have little or no effect on COVID-19 mortality, while studies that meet 2 of these 4 quality measures show a small effect. So if the stronger the quality measures are, the more quality measures, the less effect that these lockdowns seem to show, is what they're saying. And again, those were peer-reviewed versus working papers, long versus short period of time, no effect on mortality, and social science versus other sciences. Okay. I'm all the way to page 32 now, and I talked about shelter-in-place orders. So this is like some of the most draconian of all the measures as well. And they said, we have identified 13 eligible studies which estimate the effects of shelter-in-place orders, that's SIPOs, on COVID-19 mortality. 41 states in the United States issued SIPOs in the spring of 2020, but usually these were introduced after implementing other NPIs, such as school closures or workplace closures. So it gets a little murky because of that. It said the table demonstrates that the studies generally find that SIPOs have reduced COVID mortality by 2.9% on a precision-weighted average. So some are higher, some are lower, but it's an average of 2.9%, which isn't a whole lot. Okay, especially not when you were predicting like 98% will not be affected or something crazy like that. There were 4 studies that meet all quality dimensions, but had vastly different effects. The precision-weighted average of the 4 studies is minus 1.0%. 4 studies meet 3 or 4 quality dimensions, and they overall find that SIPOs increase. Now, 4 studies meet 3 of them, and those studies find that SIPOs increase COVID mortality, as precision-weighted effect is positive of 3.7. Okay, 5 studies meet 2 of 4, and it's actually 5 studies that meet 2 of 4 quality dimensions or fewer find a substantial reduction in COVID-19 mortality of minus 34%. So you're kind of all over the map depending on how quality these studies are. Now, if you have fewer studies, that's bad, but if they're quality, that's better, as opposed to you can go the other direction as well, and you can have fewer. You can have more studies that have fewer quality, but are you really getting anything valuable out of that? Okay, so let's continue to move on. The overall conclusions on SIPO studies is we find no clear evidence that SIPOs, sheltering in place, had a noticeable impact on COVID-19 mortality, right? So that's like the most draconian thing you can do, but there's no noticeable impact, like academically. And when I say academically, like statistical impact, it is meaningful. Like if you say that something's statistic in academic writing, you're saying that it's caused by something other than just randomness and chance. Okay, let's move on. So 4.3, this is section 4.3 on page 36. This study is of specific NPIs. So there's a total of 11 eligible studies look at multiple specific NPIs independently or simply lockdown versus no lockdown. The variety in these definitions can be seen in the analysis of non-essential business closures and bar restaurant closures. And the differences, they say, quote, the differences in choice of NPIs and the number of NPIs make it challenging to create an overview of the results, but the lockdown measure varies from study to study. The estimates of and the effect of face masks is based on only 2 studies. So there's only really 2 solid studies that within this criterion on the efficacy of face masks. But here's what they find with trying to reduce these with the proper variables. Okay, quote, there is no evidence of a noticeable relationship between the most used NPIs and COVID-19. So the most used ways of like school closures and go to Zoom and work at home and whatever. Overall lockdowns and limiting gatherings seems to increase COVID-19 mortality, although the effect is modest. So a modest effect means, yes, something is happening, but it's not terribly significant. It's not very meaningful. 0.06 and 1.6% respectively. And border closures had little to no effect on COVID-19 mortality. Yeah, once it gets in, it's just going to spread. With a precision weighted average of 0.1%, removing the imprecise outlier. Okay, and so yeah, at a certain point, so if you could have prevented anybody with COVID from entering the country before it got here, that's a different story than once people get in. And between closing airports or people coming over the border or whatever else, I mean, you have to lock it down before that. Otherwise, it's too little too late. Okay, quote, we find a small effect of school closure. This is minus 4.4, but this estimate is mainly driven by one particular study. And as we noted earlier, they used an interrupted time series study approach and may capture other effects such as seasonal and behavioral effects, which makes that particular study not really that useful. Okay. Mandating face masks, they say. And now this is going to be probably the most controversial part here. Mandating face masks, an intervention that was not widely used in the spring of 2020, and in many countries was even discouraged, seems to have a large effect, minus 21.2. But this conclusion is based only on 2 studies. So you can't really say much about it because you don't really have enough evidence. Like, remember the flipping the coin example? 2 studies isn't enough to actually give you something that you can hang your hat on and say, see, face masks don't work, or see, face masks work, whichever it is. Okay. Liu et al., who 2021, who conclude that 14 of 16 identified randomized controlled trials comparing face masks to no face mask controls failed to find significantly statistic benefit in the intent to treat populations. Okay, so it doesn't look like it works, but that's from 2 studies. Maybe it doesn't. Let's say that it doesn't. You can't really hang your hat on that anyway, just because of that. Okay, this does not imply, they go on, quote, this does not imply, does not necessarily imply that mandated face masks does not reduce mortality, as other factors may play a role. For example, wearing a mask may function as a tax on socializing if people are bothered by wearing face masks, even when they're socializing. So they just wearing a face mask may cause you to stay at a distance or not go out or whatever. There are other confounding variables, and the authors are honest about that. Next, page 38, quote, only business closure consistently showed evidence of a negative relationship with COVID-19 mortality, but the variation of the estimate effect is large. So does it show it? Does it not? I mean, it's all over the map. 2 of the larger effects are related to closing bars and restaurants. Okay, it makes sense. Closing bars, right? These people are drunk and not necessarily staying out of each other's space, where in the supermarket, if the face mask does anything, it shows me like, oh, steer clear of this person and walk around. Stop breathing their germs. Okay, I mean, that's probably as the idea that I see the person with the mask on and then I go, yeah, I'll give them a little extra distance, is probably as or more effective than whatever's getting through that mask to begin with. But closing bars, I can see how that would have an effect. The precision weighted average of all estimates across all MPIs is 0.6, so less than 1%. So it's tiny, it's minuscule. So the overall conclusions for specific NPIs, they say this, quote, that we find no evidence that lockdowns, school closures, border closures, and limiting gatherings have a noticeable effect on COVID-19 mortality. There is some evidence that business closures reduce COVID-19 mortality, but the variation in estimates is large and the effects seem related to closing bars. Okay. So, and there's both restaurants and bars were there, but bars was really the heavy hitter. And that kind of makes intuitive sense. Okay. Finally, this is section 5, concluding observations. This is page 40. If you're following along, if you're trying to read this while you're listening to this, they say this quote, overall, our meta analysis fails to confirm that lockdowns have had a large, significant effect on mortality rates. So, locking down doesn't really do more than not locking down, is what they're saying. The average, I'm continuing to read, the average lockdown in Europe and the United States only reduced COVID mortality by 2% compared with COVID-19 policy based solely on recommendations. Sheltering in place orders were also ineffective. They only reduced COVID-19 mortality by 2.9%. Studies looking at specific NPIs, that's lockdown versus no lockdown, face masks, closing non-essential businesses, border closing, school closures, limiting gatherings, also found no broad-based evidence of noticeable effects on COVID-19 mortality. They go on. However, closing non-essential businesses seems to have had some effect, reducing COVID-19 mortality by 10.6%, which is likely to be related to the closure of bars. Also, masks may reduce COVID-19 mortality, but there's only one study that examines universal mask mandates. So you just the evidence is too weak based on how they set this up to determine whether the masks actually have an effect on mortality. Now, there's other evidence out there in other articles, and I'm not getting into that, but they did not find it. Okay, because they had a sample in a particular way, so this meta-analysis would not allow it because they didn't have a large enough sample. Okay, so the discussion, they say, overall, quote, overall, we conclude that lockdowns are not an effective way of reducing mortality rates during a pandemic. Now, what's really interesting is the very next line. They say, our results are in line with the World Health Organization writing group in 2006. Now, this 2006, nowhere near the current pandemic. In 2006, who state, quote, reports from the 1918 influenza pandemic indicate that social distance measures did not help or appear to dramatically reduce transmission. So 100 years ago, we knew that this wasn't working. Okay, they go on, quote, our findings are also in line with Allen's 2021 conclusion. The most recent research has shown that lockdowns have had, at best, a marginal effect on a number of COVID-19 deaths. And then they quote another scholar who concludes that, quote, interventions are generally effective in mitigating COVID-19 spread. But again, they're not great at, having a real dampening effect on the spread. Okay. Now, academics try to be as neutral as possible. And if they're not being neutral, that's a sign that something's wrong. Like if they're like being really biased and not looking at both sides of things, that's a sign that this is not good academics. But they say this, quote, our review does not point out why lockdowns did not have the effect promised. We propose 4 factors. First, people respond to dangers outside their door. When the pandemic rages, people believe in social distancing regardless of what government mandates. And I thought, that's right. I mean, when this first broke, even without mandates, people were like, I took the position of, instead of going to Walmart like every day or every other day, let me try to go once a week and be efficient about it and get in and get out and be done with it, right? That's what people do. They make these calculations and they alter their behavior. So we believe that Allen, I'm continuing to read, so we believe that Allen 2021 is right when he concludes, quote, the ineffectiveness of lockdowns stemmed from individual changes in behavior, either non-compliance or behavior that mimicked lockdowns, right? So if they're not doing it or they're already doing behavior that mimics lockdowns, like me and my shopping trips to Walmart, or in place of Walmart, my wife ordering stuff on Amazon that comes to the door. They go on and say, quote, in economic terms, you can say that the demand for costly disease prevention efforts like social distancing and increased focus on hygiene is high when infection rates are high. Sure, people make these decisions. Like, let people use their own brains and make these decisions. And guess what? They do. Okay, they go on a couple lines below. Kirby 2021 finds that voluntary behavioral changes are 10 times as important as mandatory behavioral changes in combating COVID-19. Right. So people already shifting to what's going on. And that's a large part of what's happening, of why you're having very limited. So it's not saying that the that doing these things, that staying away from other people doesn't help some. It's suggesting that, but it's also suggesting that without being heavy-handed, without having to nuke them and say, you must do this, you must stay completely in your place, people are already kind of shifting gears. And that's why Netflix went through the roof. That's why Peloton stock rose in the early part of 2020 and middle of 2020. Okay, back to this. So, second, mandates only regulate a fraction of our potential contagious contacts and can hardly regulate or enforce hand washing, coughing etiquette, distancing in supermarkets. So, mandates don't actually solve all that needs to be solved. And so that's another part of this. Number three, they said third, even if lockdowns are successful initially, behavioral responses may counteract the effect completely as people respond to the lower risk by changing behavior. So you see people respond to high risk, they change behavior, and then low risk, well, they change back and they get slack again. That's how people respond because it's not as much of a threat, and so their calculation changes. I'm on page 42, by the way, if you're trying to follow along. Fourth, they said, quote, unintended consequences may play a larger role than recognized. And they're talking about things like SIPOs, the sheltering in place. Which may isolate an infected person at home with his or her family, where he or she risks infecting other family members. You could also have lockdowns have limited people's access to safe outdoor places such as beaches and parks. Like they could get out in nature, and that's exactly what we did. So I'm in South Carolina, and we didn't have like a shelter in place or that kind of thing. But what my kids and I did, we would, instead of going out and seeing friends, we'd go out and we found all kinds of nature trails that were not too far within a drivable distance. And so we spent time walking in the woods, and so they got their exercise, fresh air, that kind of thing. But if you have a lockdown where you can't be out anywhere, that's limiting even that. And so there are consequences for that. They said this, quote, we do find some evidence that limiting gatherings was counterproductive and increased COVID-19 mortality. And then they said, finally, a few concluding concepts. If timing is very important relative to strictness, this suggests that well-timed but very mild lockdowns should have worked. However, there is little solid evidence supporting the timing thesis because it's inherently difficult to analyze. So they're not saying it doesn't work, but it's really hard to get that right. That's what they're saying. Okay, what explains the differences between countries? Because different countries have different outcomes, right? Several studies, they say, point out a less obvious factors such as culture, communication, and coincidence. For example, for the same policy, stringency, countries with more obedient and collectivist cultural traits experienced larger declines in geographic mobility relative to their more important individualistic counterparts. So countries that are collectivist, think like China and much of Asia, and high obedience to authority. So this is like the opposite of the US, right? We're on all indications of all scales, like the Globe study and other things along those lines, we're like the most individualist country on earth. Okay, and then the high obedience to authority, so countries that are more collectivist and more obedient to authority are going to listen to that. It's not going to work so well in other places. Also, government communication may have played a large role. So I'm on the bottom of page 42. So they give the example of the Swedes. The Swedish health authorities were far more subdued and embraced the idea of public health versus economic trade-off. That it's not just a public health crisis, which is what you hear on the mainstream news here all the time. There's also economic consequences. Like if you shut down, these people's businesses are going under. We say, so what? as if they didn't spend their lives trying to coordinate. Now, part of what's going on right now with the supply chain is because we've radically changed all the assumptions about how business gets done. And people who don't understand how business works, they don't even factor in these economic trade-offs. But these trade-offs are real and they're relevant. And to ignore them, you ignore them at your peril. They gave an example of the Swedes versus the Norwegians. And then the Swedes, by all kinds of measures, would do things like Swedes were less likely than Norwegians not to meet with friends, to avoid public transportation, and to stay at home. And by like 20 points, like 55 versus 87, 72 verse 82, 71 verse 87 for each of those respectively. That is, despite a more severe pandemic, Swedes were less affected in their daily activities. Okay, let me continue here. So there's policy implications to everything that they've said here, and that's really what we're going for. They say this, and this is the middle of the page on page 43. Our study fails to demonstrate, and this is really the conclusion, right? Our study fails to demonstrate significant positive effects of mandated behavioral changes, such as lockdowns. This should draw our focus to the role of voluntary behavioral changes. So if you just put out the information, let people decide, let people factor it in, guess what? They make most of the changes that are necessary as if you were heavy-handed. Okay, a little bit further down the bottom, the last paragraph, lockdowns during the initial phase of the COVID-19 pandemic have had devastating effects. They have contributed to reducing economic activity, raising unemployment, reducing schooling, causing political unrest, contributing to domestic violence, and undermining liberal democracy. And they conclude, such a standard benefit cost calculation leads to a strong conclusion that lockdowns should be rejected out of hand as a pandemic policy instrument. Okay, so the rest of that, that's page 43. It's a 60-page study. The rest of it is appendices and references and charts and things along those lines. But what's the conclusion? So the conclusion is, I mean, some of my colleagues and I were saying this a long time ago, like, don't say you must do this. Put out the information and let people like be reasonable and go, you know what, it's probably a good idea not to go do these things. And guess what? Most people will take care of themselves. They're responsible. Not everybody's going to do it. Well, what about not everybody's going to do it? Not everybody does it, even though there's like people still violate the law, even though the law is there. People will still violate this policy, the heavy-handed lockdown, even though you make the policy. All you're doing is like adding extra pressure and angst to the process. Now, I don't have a quote for contemplation for today, but I have a concept. And that is, so I've been into martial arts for years. And one of the principles is use the least force necessary in order to accomplish your objective. So that is the way that we should be thinking about these kind of things. Like, what is the minimum force necessary in order to achieve the objective? And they said, like, put the information out there. Government, your role is to communicate what's going on, to take care of the least of these. Like, don't do Andrew Cuomo and like, well, for the sake of equity, seniors have to go back into the senior center. They're actually the ones spreading it the most. Don't do that. But do communicate. Do make sure that you're like, my brother's a health inspector, right? And he's a health inspector in the county where my parents are. So you better believe that senior center, that senior facility was locked down really well. Okay, so I'm not against them doing their due diligence at all. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying that being heavy-handed, like they were in New York State, like they were in California, like they are in Australia, don't do that. Just have respect for people and let them make their decisions. Hey, I've been way longer than I meant to be, but I mean, it was an important article and it helped you understand how things actually work. So it was worth the time. Thanks for listening. And I hope that this helps you understand what's going on with the pandemic. And I hope it helps you become the kind of leader that you would want to follow.